Welcome back to Real Truth, Real Justice. Today we discuss Utah's history with the Mormon Church, how they indoctrinated and committed genocide against Native American Indians. This is episode 1.
On a dark desert highway, cool wind in my hair.
Brigham Young traveled west and, similar to other pioneers of the western frontier, settled on land that at the time was inhabited by various Native American tribes. The Utes in the east, hence the name Utah, the Shoshones in the north, the Goshutes in the west, and the Paiutes in the southwest. The Saints intentionally settled in a shared buffer zone area between some of these tribes. The relationship between the Saints and the natives was complex. Sometimes they got along fine. Sometimes relations were much more deadly. Let's talk about it. By our modern 21st century standards, Brigham Young and the Saints did not treat Native Americans particularly well. That said, as historian Leonard Arrington noted, viewed in the 19th century context when ruthless exploitation and genocide were all too common, Brigham displayed moderation and a willingness to share. In 1866, Brigham Young remarked, "We could circumscribe their camps and exile every man, woman, and child of them. This is what others have done, and if we were to do it, what better are we than the wicked and the ungodly? It is our duty to be better than they in our administration of justice and our general conduct toward the Lamanites. It is not our duty to exile them, but it is our duty to save their lives and the lives of their children." Brigham Young's reference to the natives as Lamanites is important. As per the church's website, Latter-day Saints viewed Indians as a chosen people, fellow Israelites who were descendants of Book of Mormon peoples and thus heirs to God's promises. That said, pioneers also viewed Native Americans as a people fallen into decay. They were viewed as fellow children of God and yet not as equals. Relations between the Saints and Native Americans in the 19th century were often positive. Some Indians even distinguished between Mormonists, whom they considered friendly, and other American settlers, who were known as Americans. But things weren't always butterflies and rainbows, as more and more Latter-day Saints came to Utah, and as new settlements continued to be established. Tensions began to rise and conflict often ensued. The best general summary I've seen comes from Paul Reeves' book Religion of a Different Color. The relationships between Mormons and Indians in the Great Basin were frequently messy. Mormons baptized, married, ordained, murdered, indentured, befriended, fought with, traded with, fed, employed, warred against, and ultimately aided in the displacement of Native Americans to reservations. The first notable conflict occurred in early 1849 after a band of renegade Utes stole some of the settlers' cattle. Researcher Howard Christie noted that these were Utes who had declared their hostility toward the white settlers sometime before. Reportedly, they had been driven out of Utah Valley by their chief because they refused to stop stealing cattle from the Mormons. Deciding that a show of force was in order, President Young sent a company of militia to take such measures as would put a final end to depredations in the future. The militia surrounded the band and demanded that they surrender and pay for the cattle. Though they were outnumbered and outgunned, the rebels gave a war cry, shot some guns, and fired some arrows. The militia returned fire, killing several Native American men. The women and children were taken back to Salt Lake, where the Saints fed them until they were resettled among their relatives. The area near where this conflict took place was thereafter named Battle Creek. Later it was renamed Pleasant Grove. The book Mapping Mormonism notes that as the Saints continued to expand, there was a typical downward spiral of competition and conflict. Pioneer agriculture and grazing pushed out Indians' traditional food resources. Hungry Indians stole cattle. Pioneers raided Indian camps to retrieve the cattle, often killing a few Indians in the process, and Indians raided pioneer settlements in retaliation. This often led to pitched battles and even massacres and other atrocities on both sides. As a result, 2 wars were fought with the Utes, and battles with other tribes were common, as the church's website notes. Some Latter-day Saints committed excessive violence against Native peoples. Brigham Young's approach to Native Americans varied depending on the situation. Sometimes he sent out the militia to directly engage the natives. But his general approach was that it was much cheaper to feed the Indians than to fight them. Historians generally note that he tried to avoid conflict. However, truth is he did everything but try to avoid conflict. When the Wakara War broke out in 1853, Brigham ordered his people to hunker down in their forts and to only act defensively until further orders. Sometimes the saints simply didn't listen and either suffered at the hands of the natives for it or caused terrible suffering among the natives. A frequent cycle of revenge seeking made it sometimes difficult for either Brigham or Native American leaders to control their people. Some of my people might think you more to blame than they ought to think, for they do not all understand properly. Neither do I approve of what some of my people think and do with respect to the Indians, but you know some of your people are not wise in their actions. Neither are some of mine, and we must mutually forgive. On multiple occasions, Brigham chastised settlers for their treatment of the natives. Ultimately, as in other frontier areas, it was decided that the natives and the settlers could not coexist. In a series of treaties with the Shoshone, Bannock, and Goshute in 1863 and with the Ute and Southern Paiute in 1865, the federal government moved to extinguish Indian land claims in Utah and to confine all Indians on reservations. There were many programs to get Indians out of certain areas that were desirable to the Mormons. General Daniel H. Wells, pictured above, headed for Fort Utah with Brigham Young's orders not to leave that valley until every Indian was out, so they'd see a desirable valley. Push all the Indians out and take the Indians' land. The so-called Prophet Brigham Young in a letter to Daniel H. Wells in 1850. One perspective of LDS historian B. H. Roberts in his book, Comprehensive History of the Church. He writes, "It was no part of the policy of Brigham Young and the church leaders to be unduly familiar or treat as equals these degraded Indian tribes of the Salt Lake region who were cursed with the dark skin. Brigham Young didn't think the Indians could be helped by the whites." B. H. Roberts concluded that Mormons were not to become too unduly familiar with them. This was the Mormon strategy, to not treat them as equals. The native Indians were said to have been degraded and were cursed with the dark skin. Another historian, Will Bagley, stated that the whites wanted everything. Mormon Indian policy involved seizing their land, destroying anyone who resisted, and enslaving any survivors. The Mormons came in and took the land that they wanted, built their settlements where they wanted, exiled any of the native Indians who tried to stop them, enslaved all survivors, and put an indentured servitude onto the women and children. The Mormons looked at the native Indians as being called Lamanites and viewed them basically being from Israel. In other words, Israelites. But that still didn't stop them from taking their land nor stop them from committing genocide among them. Upon my research and upon learning how the Mormons treated the Native American Indians, as monstrous and evil as it was, I was constantly reminded of a parallel or aspect of this that we commonly share of similar genocide during today's time in Israel and how the natives such as the Palestinians are being exiled and land stolen from them constantly as well. Mormons still needed a place to go. They needed and wanted that land and they just basically took it. And they had greater firepower with their weapons than the Indians did. So how did the prophet Brigham Young look at these Indians? He's talking about the snake diggers or the Kamumbas in this letter to Luke Leah, who I guess was the Indian commissioner. This is in 1851. Brigham Young says, "In my first acquaintance with them, the snake diggers and Kamumbas, they appeared inoffensive and in fact, utterly incompetent. They suffered with cold and hunger and filthiness." Brigham presented them as the lowest, most degraded and loathsome specimen of human existence that he ever beheld. He didn't look too highly upon them. Just as how he looked upon the African Americans, he said they were filthy, low, degraded, and loathsome. Another excerpt from Bagley's book noted that some Indians killed a man named Lorenzo Custer, a Mormon. In retaliation, 5 Indians were exiled in Cold Beep by the said Orrin Porter Rockwell, pictured above, Lot Smith and Ed Walker. The 5 exiled Indians were clearly targeted in retaliation or revenge, all who were Mormons who gave no reason for shooting them, nor was there any evidence whatever against the Indians or their having committed any offense. In Utah, it was not the native Indians that killed Lorenzo Custer. The Mormons just wanted revenge. Sounds like they just found 5 random natives, shot them all dead without any evidence for them doing any wrongdoing whatsoever. This is how the cycle of war and violence started and continued in these early days in the state of Utah history. Even during the many other wars fought all over America during the Indian Civil Wars in other states, the Native Indians still respected the non-Mormon American people more than they did of Mormons in Utah, particularly. See above photo with writing demonstrating this sighting. Native American Indians portrayed the Mormons as no good Mormons kill and steal their lands. Many Shoshone chiefs were invited to a treaty ceremony. They declined, believing that it was a trap set by the Mormons to exile them. They seemed to have but little confidence in anything the Mormon people say to them, and decidedly stand in much fear of them. Shoshone's natives were ultimately in fear that the Mormons would meet with them, gather around all the Mormons, and then exile them. Pictured above here, a Shoshone chief. One thing that's undeniable is that the Mormons ultimately wanted the Indians' land, as they still like to do today, steal land. They also took a lot of the Indians' game, and/or drove the game out of the area, such as deer and elk, in which then became more and more scarce, which led many of the native Indians to starvation. The Mormons, when they first commenced the settlement of Salt Lake Valley, they were friendly. There wasn't that many of them, so I'm sure they had to try to be friendly with the native Indians. They may have even been outnumbered at first when the first settlers came in, but later they grew in numbers. None of these Indian tribes were happy about the Mormons coming in, settling on, and taking over their lands, while the Mormons continued friendly for a short time, but in time they became stronger in number. Then the Salt Lake City Mormons' conduct and treatment towards the Indians changed. They were not only treated unkindly, but many of the Indians were much abused. Sometimes the Indians were treated with many variations of severity abuse. They were drove by the population of Mormons from place to place. Settlements were made on all their hunting grounds in the valleys, and even the graves of their fathers in which had passed away were torn up by the Mormon whites. The Indians' game, deer and the elk, were pushed out of the area and pushed out of the valleys. The Salt Lake Native Indians were forced to leave their homes or submit to the constant abuses of the Mormon whites. Even the Gosoki Indian youth and children, who formerly lived in the Salt Lake Valley, had been killed and driven away. The Mormons seemed to never be satisfied. The Indians had moved time after time, and yet they could have no peace. The Native American Indians' hearts became sick and weakened at an immense rate of speed. The Native Indians in the Utah Territory in the general were extremely mistreated, as the Mormons being much better armed and equipped than the Indians, causing the most brutal butchery. In my opinion, this was serious genocide. Mormons caused the most brutal butchery of the Native Indians. The Saints at Ogden, Utah, all forted up throughout the entire valley. In many cases of these settlements, they built these forts in which would protect themselves while inside from the Indians, while planning to be ready to put up a fight and receive the Indians with bloody hands, with hospitable graves. The Mormons were ultimately more effective and monstrously destructive than the civil army on the other side of America fighting against the Indians in the West. For example, Mormon Siler wrote a letter to Brigham Young in 1853, Mormons annihilated 5 male Indians for stealing. Afterwards, their property, their wives, and their children was brought into the Mormon ring, in which they then confiscated their property, their wives, and yes, even their children of any age. The property and the children were then sold to the highest bidder. That's pretty insane, right? Isaac Morley, who's pictured above, bid 3 bushels of wheat for a girl that was 8 or 9 years old, but she was run up to 16 bushels and knocked off to William V. Black Jr. So William V. Black bought a girl 8 or 9 years old for 16 bushels of wheat. That was the value of an Indian girl. Statement from Benjamin Madley in his book, An American Genocide, of 2016. The United States and the California Indian Catastrophe took sustained political will at both the state and federal levels to create the laws, policies, and the well-funded annihilation machine to the Mormons needed to destroy Native people. Statement from the Prophet Brigham Young in 1848. called the Indians the devil, and said they are not equal to the Mormons or whites. Brigham Young says, treat them as Indians and not as your equals. Tie up your animals so that the devil or the Indians cannot get them. A book from 1856, Solomon Nunez Carvalho. Incidents of Travel and Adventure in the Far West. Utah Chief says, Mormons say that they no kill any more Indian. Indians had a lot of different standards in morality or chastity. They would do these clad-like dances, which the Mormons called whore dances. This is from Brigham Young's office journals again. 1. In September of 1856, Dimmock Huntington, pictured above, reported that the Indians occasionally had what they called a whore dance in which would lead the Mormon men to their camps. He asked Brigham what shall they do about these dances with the fairly unclothed Indians. Brigham replied, we will whip them. Mormons no tell the truth. Plenty of Utah's Indians have gone to the Great Spirit, and it was the Mormons who killed them. Wilford Woodruff's journal in 1850 talked about the Mormons buying Indian children. Statement from Brigham Young in his office journal 1856. He says Mr. Ruth inquired if it was difficult to rear Indian children. The President Brigham Young said that it was, I hath an Indian woman who assists me in the housekeeping and is an excellent hand at that work. I obtained her when she was just a child. Who really did own the land? Brigham Young said that it was the Lord owned the land. This is the Mormon Lord, that is, and of course, Brigham Young was the Mormon Lord's agent. Brigham Young was the Mormon Lord's servant. Brigham Young stated, yes, this is the Mormon's land. Upon this, more trauma-based mind control and manipulation continues upon the American Native Indians in Utah by the isolation and manipulative hostile Mormons of the false prophet, Brigham Young. On the next episode. And book written for their futures to come.